the reason I've decided to use now is the same reason I decided to investigate autism spectrum disorder, and the same reason I am studying human-robotic interaction. So a few years ago, I was working on the anthropological implications of the grotesque, which is literally being creeped out by things. Why are humans creeped out by wax statues, for example? And so there's a great deal of theoretical models already in place to help us talk about creepiness and the grotesque. But when I was presenting on it in a different conference setting, I was approached by somebody who was working with a group of researchers out of l'Université de Limoges, which is in France, called the Projet Ceres, which uses Aldebaran robotics to look at various human-robotic interactions in settings, primarily either in regards to children with autism spectrum disorder, but I was initially brought in to question how does one integrate the use of robots in populations that are senior, so geriatric inclusions of robotic, either in homes or in placement centers or in hospitals. So that's how I learned about Aldebaran robotics. And since then, I've moved towards the question of children with autism spectrum disorder and their language practices because really of an anecdote I heard by one of the lead neuroscientists working at the time with the project ASKNAO, who explained to me that, you know, a child one day at a fair came across a NAO robot, and from the corner of their eyes, the two researchers from Aldebaran noticed that the child's mother got very upset. So of course they ran over there to figure out what was happening. And as it turns out, the mother was not upset. She was in shock because her child had started speaking to the robot. This was a child who had otherwise never really done much in the way of speech utterances. So that for me was the door that swung open and said, oh my goodness, I would like to really use these small humanoid robots to investigate the language possibilities of children with autism spectrum disorder to see, does using robotic interaction change the data? What else can we learn? Why is it important to study robotic interaction with children with autism? Are there any caveats that we should be worried about? And so on and so forth. So as I said, there are 3 questions, but they all lead to the same place, which is essentially that human robotic interaction is certainly an interesting avenue to consider the inclusion of robots either in classrooms or what it might do in therapeutical sessions. And then does it allow us to understand more, to uncover more about speech practices of children with autism? As we all know, autism spectrum disorder is primarily diagnosed by way of evaluating the atypicity of children's behavior, either communicative, social interaction, and so on and so forth. So am I being clear? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. All right. So now moving on. So what does a linguistic anthropologist or somebody who's interested in the question of language do in terms of putting together an interdisciplinary team, and why? Well, I have 0 robotic skills or programming skills. The first year I acquired a NAO, I tried to do things myself. It was so abysmal that I was embarrassed. So I did what all smart people should do, is hire students who are actually very skilled to take care of that programming side, so I can actually focus on the research design. And the linguistic approach meant that what we were actually going to uncover, because a lot of research had already started demonstrating that what we do know, in fact, is that the robotic interaction does generate a larger speech act out of children with autism spectrum disorder for a number of reasons. So we were going to use this as a way to levy the speech patterns. But what was important for us was to be able to contribute to an open access or a largely shared scientific database that would allow for us to organize the various speech utterances and other speech phenomena that we could collect out of our observations and make them widely available to the larger research community. So that was very important to us from the beginning, and it's one aspect of our project that we continue to focus on. So what I have here on the screen is Talk. Many of you might have heard about this. TalkBank is a accessible, searchable data bank of various speech acts. So you can find here a number of data on people with aphasia, for example, or patients suffering from dementia, or anything from dyslexia to, various forms of speech impediments or language impairments and so on. So this is an already existing shared database. And very, very recently, they've added down here the ASD Bank, which has very few contributions just yet, but that will explode, I'm sure, in the near future. And this is with Dr. McWhinney that we're now working on to ensure that we can effectively continue providing data to this database so that people working on the question of autism spectrum disorder have an actual verifiable audio and measurable way to go and work with existing data. As you will see, that getting data is probably one of the hardest aspects of working on language analysis in the first place. So based on this, we had an original research plan, and I know that you can't see on the screen. We're going to break this down so you can see it in sections. We presented this at the IMFAR conference of last year, our preliminary case study that was the first wave of research that we did with 3 children to see, okay, what happens when you go into a space where there are children already receiving either ABA or IBI care, and then we insert a robot to provide some interaction there, and what happens to their speech? Do they speak more? Do they change any other aspects of their behavior? And so we went in there to do these kinds of observations initially. So the first research objectives, as you see them on the screen, was to do some already existent narrow robot programs, to put them in action to elicit and observe social speech performances. In the case studies, we had 3 first children who participated, who were already in a center and receiving ABA therapy. And all we wanted to do is look at how the children interacted and what happened to their speech. And so we did audio recordings of this, and as well a lot of observation notes to go along with this. So our methods, of course, I'm going to go over these very, very quickly. We didn't want to disrupt too much of the child's existing schedule, so we inserted ourselves when the child would have had a one-on-one either speech pathologist with them or the regular therapist doing some form of exercise. We had a very mixed method approach, of course, with the goal, as I stated earlier, to contribute to the child's database. And afterwards, we were going to do a very extensive analysis called mean length utterances, otherwise known as MLU, to see, can we quantitatively really say that the children were producing more speech after and during and after the human-robot interaction. So in order to do this kind of research, we have to use things like anthropological observations, an ethnographic approach. We need a programmer, obviously, to do everything that's nascent, perhaps already in the robot, to kind of modify those already existing robotic behaviors to satisfy our research goals. We had to obviously put in place a great deal of data management by using Access and a number of other methods such as Qualtrics and et cetera. In order to have these kinds of participants in our group, we had to do a great deal of communication and community outreach, and of course, the very linguistic practice of MLU measurement. But as you know, when we work with robots, a great deal of our emphasis goes around programming. We all get very concerned about how much the programming is going to impact the research. We want to have this as invariable as possible. We don't want it to be a very flexible aspect of the project. When we go into the field, we want to be able to say that the robot's going to behave as it should, and then we can have some kind of control over the robotic behavior, so then we can observe the child behavior as being the goal of our observations, to see that in flux and to see if, in fact, the insertion of a robot will have any effect on other behaviors. So some of the findings coming out of that, of course, demonstrate that, yes, for all 3 of our participants, and you might not be able to see this here, but I'm going to talk you through the graphs, is that every single one of our case studies, regardless of how performant the speech was initially, ended up making more speech acts. But what was very interesting to us, it wasn't just because they were spending time with the robot, but every time the robot screwed up, the child would produce the most transformative styles in speech acts. So the utterances ended up being either more performative or more explicit or certainly more engaged. Not when the robot did exactly as we had hoped it would do, which is what I just suggested tended to be the thing we wanted to control for the most, but in fact, when the robot did not behave and committed errors or malfunctions, interestingly enough, that's when the child provided the greatest change in data performance, which is what leads us to our working hypothesis switch. So when we went into the field, we said, okay, all of the various team members coming from different areas had the goal of highly controlling the robotic behavior to be able to observe and measure what the child participant was going to do. So that was our first goal, is does human-robot interaction increase the production of utterances by children with ASD? Now, after doing a few sessions, we came out with two working hypotheses who emerge, and then we come with this thing saying, oh boy, so when the robot screws up, that's when the children end up doing the greatest change, impacting their speech. And from that, we move on to a third hypothesis, which is using cognitive linguistic, looking at idealized cognitive models. And for those of you who might not know what that is, idealized cognitive models suggest that children have and all people for that matter, have as a potential use various ways of acquiring information. And from that, the way through which they acquire information, so a child spending a lot of time with their therapist, for example, would take on as a cognitive model the therapist's behavior. And when the robot is not performing as expected for whatever reason, the child was taking on this cognitive behavior, this modeled, idealized cognitive system to engage with the robot further. So what we did see is when the robot would fall over or would say yes instead of saying no, or wouldn't just get up, the children would start speaking to the robot much in the same way that the therapist would either encourage them or laugh or want to help them up. And in many cases, the therapist being in the room with the child during these observations would be astounded by the fact that here's a child who would never even react to having a sticker offered to them, suddenly turn around and offer the robot a sticker just for getting up, or saying, okay, buddy, get up, you can do it, nice work. And in utterances that were completely suitable to the interaction with clarity of expression and so on and so forth. So because of this, of course, the one thing that we had highly wanted to control in our original goals meant that the whole team, coming from a different vantage point, of course, all of a sudden said, well, now we have to kind of practice this so that the robot does screw up, so we can go out into the field again with a new hypothesis. And so that's precisely what we've done. We also had a two-pronged project to go and do this. The full phase, which we're calling now phase 3 of our project, which is we just want to go into the field again with the errors program so that we can have some predictability as to when they happened. But we have not yet done that. So what we've done very recently is we wanted to go out and do a two-prong experiment. On the one hand, we wanted to go see if we could verify if human-robot interaction might have any change to the data yielded out of a vocabulary test. And in order to do this, we used Dr. Tiger Plusberry's research on ASD and semantic categories, and we transformed this research, which explicitly has an experiment taking the children through the Peabody vocabulary test, and transformed it into a human robotic program. And so again, the use of our interdisciplinary team was very important. So we had students, both graduate and undergraduate students from psychology, put together a database that would allow us to take an existing person-led experiment and transform it into a human-robot interaction. So identifying the things, and we had to produce the various cards from the Peabody test as it could be read by the robot. And this last picture here might mean nothing to most of you. It certainly doesn't mean very much to me, is the whole script that has to come out of the programming needs in order to make the robot lead the children through the Peabody vocabulary test. And then of course we went back into the field and we let the robot do this. We're not finished doing the analysis of our data, so as soon as it is out, there will be an article attached to it, and I will be sure to make it widely available to you. So this next video is what the Peabody vocabulary test looks like in a session with the children. And during the observations of the Peabody vocabulary test, we purposefully started having a measurable value for when the robot did its errors so that we can continue working on idealized cognitive model theory to see if in fact we were onto something in terms of this. I'm going to let you watch the video. I'm not quite sure how this is going to work because it's embedded into an article. So fingers crossed here. Can you still see the screen?
Yeah.
Probably, yep, okay. This way, oh my goodness. Too many pop-up windows. Just a minute, here I go. Okay, I don't know if this is gonna work right away. I'm gonna try something else, but I won't just keep you watching me move around strangely over the screen here. So I'm gonna come back here. Can you see this still shot?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll come back to see if the video works. So all the video was doing is allowing you to see how now interacts through this vocabulary test. What we had to do, of course, in order to make the vocabulary test salient to the children, are you familiar with the Peabody vocabulary test?
No.
It could be a very long and tedious process. So how it operates is you've got 48 questions. They're all essentially the same that operate around 4 semantic groups. So in order to have the test identify how children categorize, we'll go back a few screens here so you can see a butterfly and a bat in a nest, for example. The 4 categories would operate around tools, birds, boats, and food. And in those categories, you have actual birds, you have proximal or close to in relationship. So in the category of bird, you would have a nest, which is close to a bird, but it is not a bird, or a bat, also not a bird, but it's close to because it flies, and something like a butterfly, which is, again, flying, but not a bird. And then you would have something like a hairbrush, which is most certainly not a bird. But then you would have a number of cards like penguins, roosters, peacocks, ostriches, and so on and so forth. And the child would be asked in face of a card, is this a bird? And all we record is to see if the child says yes or no. And it's completely prompted by the robot. This is very, very similar to how the Peabody vocabulary test would be run in session. However, the child is shown a screen with, it's not a screen, but a page with a number of images, and they would select the item that most corresponds with the thing. What we're looking for through a Peabody vocabulary test is how does a child organize the semantic categories of the word. So it's not unusual for children to see a bat and consider it part of the category of bird, or a nest as part of a category of bird. In this way, we can see how narrow or how wide the category is in terms of the semantic understanding of a word. And so this was an experiment that had already been conducted by, like I said earlier, Dr. Taggart-Flussberg, and we were looking to see if running this test through human-robot interaction would change the data. And it does, but as I said, unsatisfactorily, it is not ready for analysis or release yet, so I can't even give you a sneak preview of what that is. That would be sadly bad science, because we're not done evaluating all of the children. But certainly during this wave of observations, we did notice that, again, when the robot did screw up, and sometimes it does, the children would, again, enact in many respects the same idealized cognitive models that we had seen in our first case study. But as I was saying earlier on, and what I had hoped for you to see on the small video clip, is that in order to make the test run smoothly, because it is 48 very long and tedious questions, we designed a number of variations on the test that would allow different controls to experiment with different types of robotic interaction. So sometimes the robot, every 5 or 10 cards, would do a small little dance. Other times they would have encouraging comments, and other times every 10 cards they would have a more significant game to play that would take them outside of the Peabody and back in again. So as I promised, as soon as all of that data is releasable, I will make sure that our findings are shared. So the next phase now is we're going to continue working in this interdisciplinary team, which is the purpose of this talk. And I tried to do by providing sufficient examples that research with robots, of course, necessitate good programmers, but they have to be embedded within a very interdisciplinary team where all the various aspects of the project should be known and shared by all of the team members. So much as my example, when we went into the field with our first working hypothesis, we quickly emerged with with one established hypothesis, we quickly emerged with two working hypotheses. That meant that we had to adapt on the fly. And in order for that to happen, every team member has to be able to contribute in their own way to the redesigning and the recalibrating, if you will, of the various methods we would be using in the field. So interdisciplinary teams are important, and I last year gave a TED talk on this, but they're actually vital to any kind of robotic inclusion in research design, especially if it's going to impact a population group or participant-based observation research. And the reason for that, as my example, I hope, demonstrated, is that there's a lot of modifications to be done on the fly, and the more your team is invested in all aspects of your project and they feel that they're contributing to all various aspects of the project, the better you're going to be to adjust to the various discoveries that you make on the way. And in this next phase, of course, we're going to continue with new collaborations, and as we've done, because we modified a lot of the original behaviors that were available on the now in the first platform that we had access to, which was the 1.14. And then, of course, Aldebaran switched up to the 2.1 on Choreograph. The ASKNAO initiative slightly disappeared and then it vanished. And so we operated in the dark, which is one of the reasons why I was very pleased to have Mike Radis reach out to us, because there needs to be a community around programming, especially when we're working with a kind of tool that is quick to become obsolete. And the reason for that is that research is dependent on some longitudinal studies as well, as many of you know, I'm sure. And to have to reinvent the wheel at every year, and that's being generous, means that the study in and of itself has to sacrifice a great deal of its progress in terms of methods and design, because there is no continuity within the actual interface. So anything that would help in building a community just around the programming value of robot means that it continues to be a salient tool in observations like the ones that we do. And of course, we are more than willing to continue sharing our files. In fact, somebody from l'Université du Québec à Rimouski reached out to us in hopes that we might be able to help him establish some kind of shareability. And of course, like I just said, not to have to reinvent the wheel, especially when one person figures out a hitch or a glitch in the system. It would be really wonderful to be able to share that. So my hope is, although I have an immediate interdisciplinary team for my research projects, anybody interacting with robots for research design should also have this larger community or very large interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary team with whom we can share and exchange knowledge. And of course, as I said, because interdisciplinarity for us also means to be able to share to a larger database of researchers primarily working in linguistics, we keep opening the doors for research that is extended far beyond any kind of limited field. And then, of course, eventually, when our findings do become more consistent, and then we can eventually come out with an actual model or working model for the integration of human-robot interaction in either clinical or pedagogical settings, we would hope to be able to continue down that vein, and then, like I just said, continue opening the margins of the collaboration. And so finally, again, from a purely theoretical point, it's to come to terms or get our grips firmly around what cognitive modeling theory might look like in future robotic design and what we might be able to contribute to the next generation of robotic researchers. And then coming back to our original question is, how is language organized in the mind, which is the first question we ask in many respects in cognitive linguistics, and what most of our projects will come back to investigating in many respects. So that is my presentation for you. I'm going to, nope, not do that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to see you guys more clearly now. There you go. If you have any questions for me, I know that I went over my 20 minutes with great apologies.
No, that's great.
I do have a question for you. It's great that you use the P-body because it is a standardized test and you can check it out for individuals on the autism spectrum. Out of curiosity, are you planning to use a comparison group like kids who have dyslexia or dysphasia or apraxia, just to see if there is benefits to both, or if one has more benefits, like the robot-mediated intervention works more with one group than the other?
Yes, in fact, we are. So we are going to be working with a team of graduate students in psychology to work on 2 control groups. Because we're replicating an original experiment by Dr. Tiger Flesberg, we are going to see it through to its completion. So we are going to work with a group of typically developing children and then a group of children with Down syndrome.
Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, for the same purposes, because the robots are eliciting responses not only, different responses not only in children with autism spectrum disorder, but also across the board. Any children who interact with robots, of course, are going to do so in a very different fashion than interacting with another human being.